all we've had to do to get started here is to add this source section to our configuration in the CDK. And we're just saying, use GitHub, use this URL, use this GitHub connection, use this configuration file, and AppRunner will do the rest. Hello everyone, and welcome to another video on building serverless .NET applications with one of the easiest to use services on AWS, and that is AWS AppRunner. In this video, we're going to have a look at one of the really cool features of AppRunner, which is that AppRunner can actually compile and deploy your application code on your behalf. So in the other videos where we've looked at AppRunner, we've had to pre-build a container image, push that to ECR, and then we can set up the configuration and let AppRunner pull that image. But actually, there's a feature of AppRunner that allows you to just AppRunner to your GitHub repository, and it will do the rest itself. First, we're going to start in our IDE, and we're going to have a look at one of the configuration files. So there's a couple of different ways you can configure this functionality in AppRunner. One is that you can simply specify a build command and a start command. And that build command might be .NET publish, and that run command might just be .NET and run. But you can also use this configuration file format to actually add some more advanced configuration if you need it. So let's configure what we've got here. So we're using the built-in .NET 6 runtime. At this moment in time, AppRunner only supports .NET 6 as a built-in runtime. And then we can specify our build command. So we're going to run a .NET publish, and we're going to pass in the path to a .NET 6 version of our AppRunner API. We're going to compile that in release, and then we're going to output all of our application files to a folder. And then we've got our actual run command. We're going to use 6.0.9 .NET 6, and our actual run command to actually execute our application is just going to be the .NET command and then the path to our compiled DLL. We set up our network configuration. AppRunner is expecting our application to run on port 5000. And then in our actual environment variables for our running application, we're setting the ASP.NET Core URL's environment variable to 5000. That'll ensure that our .NET application actually starts up on port 5000. Our .NET API is the same one we've been using for all of these AppRunner videos. We've got our simple weather forecast controller, and then we've got some health checks configured as well on the /health endpoint. So you can actually deploy all of this using the AWS CDK, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. But first, let's start in the actual console and look at how we can do this in the console. If I create a new AppRunner service, I've got this source code repository option. I've already pre-configured a connection to my personal GitHub account. That's what you can see here. If this is your first time and you're following along, you can just hit that add new button and set up the connection to your GitHub account. I want this to be the AWS AppRunner repository, and I want it to use the main branch of my repository, and I want to use manual deployments. Now, AppRunner does support a deployment every time you push a new version of your code to the branch that you specify. It could be really useful for your development environments. Hit next here, and then we have a couple of options here. We can either configure our settings in the UI, and if I set .NET 6, I specify my build start command as well as my port. But actually, I'm just going to press use a configuration file, and AppRunner will then read that AppRunner.yaml file from the root of my repository. That's what we are looking at just over here. AppRunner is going to read this and use this to deploy my application. If I then hit next, I get the standard AppRunner configuration options. So let's call this .NET build from code sample. We're going to scale this right down to the lowest CPU and the lowest memory. We will just check that the health check is set up correctly. So we want it to be a HTTP health check running on our /health endpoint. We don't need to add any permissions. We're going to leave the networking as just completely public at the minute. And that is all we need to do. That is as simple as it is to get started using AppRunner with a GitHub connection. When I press next here, I'll just get a review of all the options I've set up, and then I can press create and deploy. And AppRunner is now going to go off, pull my application code from the branch I've specified, and use this configuration file to publish and run my .NET application. Now, while that's running, let's just quickly have a look at the CDK variation of this. We've got this CDK application stack with build from code. Still left the version of this in here that uses ECR. We've now got this additional option to use build from code. And all we've changed is this source section. Instead of using source from ECR, we're using source from GitHub and passing in our GitHub repository props. Our source is going to be, our configuration is going to be sourced from our repository. Could also say here, pass in API, and that means that I need to manually configure my configurations. If I was to set that to be API, I would then also need to populate this code configuration values object with all of my additional configurations. I've got the runtime, what build command I want to use, start, etc., etc. But I'm actually going to use that configuration file from my repository. So if I set that to repository, this tells AppRunner to read that from the root of my source code repository. My GitHub connection, ARN, I'm going to pass in from an environment variable, and the same for my repository URL, just so I can switch and change that really easily. And of course, I want to use the main branch in my repository. And everything else here is exactly the same as it was. Then in my CDK project, I'm just going to come back to the main stack. And instead of using my application stack, I'm going to use my application stack with build from code. So this will now use that build from code configuration option. We've already got this network stack that we had from one of our other videos, which actually just set up my VPC and my security groups and all that other stuff. Let's go off to the terminal now, clear all that down. So I've already gone in and set both of these environment variables. The environment variables are both the connection ARN, you can get that from the console, and the URL of your repository that you want to use. If I run a CDK deploy now, we can actually go off and deploy this AppRunner service. One of the benefits of doing this is that you don't have to worry about pre-compilation of your application, because you don't have to worry about Docker containers and building Docker images and all of that tooling. You can simply point AppRunner at your repository and it will do the rest. Now, currently that only supports GitHub, has the repository source, but it's a really, really nice, easy and quick way to get started building your applications in a fully serverless way. Whilst the CDK deploy command complete, because we are deploying NAT gateways and things like that, so it does take a little while to generate. I'll pause the video. I'll be back in just a moment. The CDK deployment has completed now. As part of that output, we have got our AppRunner application URL. So if I grab a copy of that, copy to my web browser and hit that endpoint, and of course at the root, I get my status code 200. And if I just check my health check endpoint, I get. That is as simple as it is to get started using AWS AppRunner. And if, of course, you push a new version of your source code to GitHub and you've got automatic deployments enabled, then AppRunner will automatically pick that up and deploy that. But if not, you can come to the console or using the AWS CLI, hit that deploy button, and Runner will now pull a newer version of your source code, recompile that, redeploy that using a form blue-green deployment using that health check URL, meaning that your existing version of the service won't get switched over until the newly compiled version passes the health check successfully. So you've got blue-green deployments kind of built into the service. All you need to make sure is that any of the logic that ensures your services are running is in that health check endpoint configuration. All we've had to do to get started here is to add this source section to our configuration in the CDK. And we're just saying, use GitHub, use this URL, use this GitHub connection, use this configuration file, and AppRunner will do the rest. By far the easiest way to get started building .NET applications in a serverless way on AWS. As always, if you've liked this video, please like, please subscribe, and I will see you all next time for more serverless AWS fun. Thanks for watching.